In the year that King Uzziah died, the throne room of heaven opened to a young man in Jerusalem, and nothing in the world would ever look the same to him again. But before that moment came, before the seraphim and the smoke and the voice that would reshape his entire existence, there was simply a nation holding its breath, a city thick with uncertainty, and a man walking through temple courts with questions he could not answer and burdens he could not name. The year was approximately 740 before the Common Era, and Judah stood at a crossroads it did not fully understand. For 52 years Uzziah had occupied the throne, one of the longest reigns in the nation's history, exceeded only by Manasseh's dark tenure that would come generations later. 52 years was long enough for an entire generation to be born, grow old, and die knowing no other king. It was long enough for Uzziah's name to become synonymous with stability itself, for his presence on the throne to feel less like political arrangement and more like natural law. The sun rose in the east, the rains came in their seasons, and Uzziah ruled in Jerusalem. These were simply the facts of existence, and what a reign it had been. The chroniclers would remember Uzziah as a king who did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, at least for most of his years. He had rebuilt Eloth and restored it to Judah, extending the kingdom's reach to the shores of the Red Sea. He had waged successful campaigns against the Philistines, breaking down the walls of Gath and Jabneh and Ashdod, building cities in Philistine territory as demonstrations of Judean power. The Ammonites paid him tribute. The Munites fell before his armies. His fame spread as far as the border of Egypt, for he had made himself exceedingly strong. But Uzziah's achievements extended beyond the battlefield. He was a king who understood that true power required infrastructure, not just armies. He built towers in Jerusalem, fortifying the corner gate and the valley gate and the angle, strengthening the city's defences against any future siege. In the wilderness, he constructed cisterns to capture the precious rainfall, enabling settlement in regions that had previously been too arid for habitation. He loved the soil, an unusual passion for a monarch, and he cultivated vineyards and farms throughout the hill country and the fertile plains. Under his leadership, Judah had prospered in ways it had not known since the golden age of Solomon. His army reflected this prosperity. The chroniclers recorded its exact dimensions: 3,700 fighting men, organised under 2,600 commanders, equipped with shields and spears and helmets and coats of mail, with bows and stones for slinging. Uzziah himself had designed engines of war, devices mounted on the towers and corners of Jerusalem's walls that could shoot arrows and hurl large stones at approaching enemies. The surrounding nations learned to respect Judean power, and for decades that respect had translated into peace. Yet now the great king lay dying, and he had been dying for years. The story of Uzziah's downfall was whispered throughout Jerusalem, a cautionary tale that even children knew. At the height of his power, when his fame had spread and his heart had swelled with pride, the king had made a fatal mistake. He had entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar, a sacred act reserved exclusively for the descendants of Aaron, the consecrated priests who alone were permitted to approach that holy place. When Azariah, the chief priest, and 80 courageous colleagues confronted him, demanding that he leave, Uzziah had raged at them, the censer still smoking in his hand. And in that moment of prideful fury, leprosy had broken out on his forehead, visible to all, undeniable in its meaning. God himself had answered the king's presumption. They had rushed him out of the temple, or perhaps he had rushed himself, the chroniclers noted, for the Lord had struck him. From that day until his death, Uzziah lived in a separate house, cut off from the temple he had violated, isolated from the palace he had built, excluded from the public life he had dominated for decades. His son Jotham had taken over the government, managing the daily affairs of the kingdom, while his father wasted away in quarantine, a living lesson in the dangers of overreaching. Now even that diminished existence was ending. The king who had once commanded armies and engineered siege works lay confined to his sick chamber, his skin marked with the disease that had defined his final years, his glory a fading memory, his throne soon to pass to another. Uzziah was dying, and with him, an era. The mood in Jerusalem reflected this impending loss. There was grief, certainly, the genuine sorrow that comes when familiar things pass away, when the landmarks by which people have oriented their lives suddenly disappear. But beneath the grief lay something more unsettling: fear. For all his flaws, Uzziah had been strong, and strength in a king meant security for his people. What came next was uncertain. Jotham was capable enough, but he was not his father. He had not built the walls or won the wars or earned the respect that kept enemies at bay. And the enemies were watching. To the north and east, the Assyrian Empire was stirring with new aggression. Tiglath-Pileser III had seized the throne in Nineveh just a few years earlier, and unlike his predecessors, this king had ambitions that reached far beyond Mesopotamia. He was reorganizing the Assyrian military, perfecting the tactics of siege warfare, developing systems of deportation and resettlement that would allow him to absorb conquered peoples into his empire permanently. The small kingdoms of the Levant, Israel, Judah, Aram, the Philistine cities, the Phoenician ports, had always existed in the shadow of great empires, but for generations those empires had been occupied with internal struggles. Now Assyria was looking outward, and what it saw was prey. The northern kingdom of Israel felt this threat most acutely. Menahem sat on the throne in Samaria, a usurper who had waded through blood to reach his crown, and his kingdom was rotting from within. Political assassinations had become almost routine in the north. Kings rose and fell with dizzying speed, each new ruler more desperate than the last. The prophets spoke of coming judgment, of an end to the northern kingdom, of Assyrian armies sweeping through the land like a flood. In Judah, people watched their northern cousins with a mixture of contempt and anxiety. Surely God would not allow the same fate to befall his chosen city, his holy temple, his faithful remnant in the south. Surely Jerusalem was different. But was it? This was the question that troubled anyone with eyes to see and ears to hear. The forms of worship continued in the temple, the daily sacrifices, the festival observances, the prescribed rituals that marked the rhythm of Israel's religious life. Priests performed their duties, Levites sang their songs, the incense rose and the blood flowed, and the external machinery of faith ground on, as it always had. Yet something was hollow at the centre. The same people who offered sacrifices in the morning bowed to foreign gods in the evening. The same merchants who observed the Sabbath cheated their customers the other 6 days. The same nobles who sat in places of honour at religious feasts oppressed the poor and perverted justice in the courts. The worship was real in its forms but empty in its substance, a shell of religion that had lost its transforming core. Through the streets of this anxious city walked a young man named Isaiah, son of Amoz. We know little of his origins beyond his father's name, but everything about his later life suggests noble birth and privileged access. He moved comfortably in royal circles, speaking to kings with an ease that suggested familiarity rather than intimidation. He knew the temple intimately, its courts and its rituals, its history and its meaning. He was educated, articulate, capable of crafting Hebrew poetry of such beauty and power that his words would shape the language itself for millennia to come. He was not a peasant prophet called from the fields like Amos, nor a priest's son set apart from birth like Jeremiah would be. He was a son of Jerusalem's elite, raised in privilege, trained in the traditions of his people, positioned to live a comfortable life of influence and respect. But comfort had not found him. As Isaiah walked through the city he loved, he felt the weight of what he saw pressing down on him like a physical burden. The gap between what Judah professed and what it practiced was not an abstraction to him. It was a grief, a constant ache, a splinter in his soul that would not let him rest. He saw the widows ignored and the orphans exploited. He heard the pious phrases that masked corrupt hearts. He watched the leaders of his nation, stumbling toward disaster with their eyes fixed on the short-term gains, unable or unwilling to see the storm gathering on the horizon. There was something in Isaiah that could not look away, could not make peace with the contradiction, could not shrug and accept that this was simply how the world worked. He was sensitive in the way that prophets are sensitive, attuned to moral frequencies that others had learned to tune out, responsive to spiritual realities that most people experienced only dimly, if at all. This sensitivity was not comfortable. It was in many ways a curse. It meant that he felt the wrongness of things when others felt nothing, that he grieved when others celebrated, that he lay awake with questions that never troubled his neighbour's sleep. What was God doing? Why did he allow his people to drift so far from his ways? Would judgment come, as it had come so often before, or would mercy prevail once more? And if judgment came, what would it look like? Would it be the Assyrian armies everyone feared? Would it be plague or famine or civil war? Or would it be something worse? The slow, quiet withdrawal of divine presence, the departure of glory that would leave Jerusalem looking the same but emptied of everything that made it holy. These questions had no answers, or at least none that Isaiah could find on his own. He was young, perhaps still in his 20s, old enough to see the problems but too young to have grown cynical about them. He still believed that truth mattered, that God was real, that the ancient promises had not been revoked. He still hoped, against accumulating evidence, that Judah could turn, could repent, could become again what it had been called to be. But hope without direction is just longing, and longing without purpose is just pain. The temple drew him, as it had drawn his ancestors for generations. When everything else was uncertain, the temple remained. Those massive stones that Solomon had laid, those courts where the presence of God was said to dwell, that altar where the blood of countless sacrifices had been poured out in acknowledgement of human sin and divine mercy. The temple was the centre of Israel's world, the place where heaven and earth were believed to intersect, the geographic and spiritual heart of everything the nation claimed to be. If answers existed, surely they could be found there. If God would speak, surely he would speak in his own house. And so Isaiah walked toward the temple courts, one more worshipper among many, one more troubled soul seeking clarity in a world that offered none. He did not know that he was walking toward the most significant moment of his life. He did not know that the questions tormenting him were about to be answered in ways he could never have anticipated. He did not know that before this day ended, he would see things that no living man had seen, hear words that would burn themselves into his memory forever, and speak a response that would define not only his own future but the future of prophetic witness for all time. The nation trembled on the edge of darkness. A king lay dying. An empire was rising. A people wandered in spiritual fog, going through religious motions while their hearts grew ever more distant from the God they claimed to serve. And a young man climbed the temple steps, carrying nothing but his questions and his grief, and his desperate, inarticulate hope that somewhere beyond the confusion, God was still paying attention. Heaven was indeed paying attention, and heaven was about to break through. The temple complex rose above Jerusalem like a crown upon a king's head, its white limestone walls catching the afternoon sun and throwing light back across the city below. Solomon had built it nearly 2.5 centuries earlier, and though time and conquest had weathered some of its original glory, the structure remained the most magnificent in all of Judah. Its courts ascended in terraces toward the inner sanctuary, each level more restricted than the last, each step upward a step closer to the presence that was said to dwell in the darkness beyond the great veil. For any Israelite, approaching the temple was an act laden with meaning. For Isaiah, on this particular day, it felt like approaching the only solid ground in a world that had begun to shift beneath his feet. He passed through the outer gates where merchants had set up their tables, exchanging foreign currency for the temple coinage required for offerings, selling doves and lambs to worshippers who had travelled too far to bring their own sacrifices. The sounds of commerce mingled strangely with the sounds of worship. The bleating of animals, the clink of coins, the haggling of buyers and sellers, all conducted in the shadow of the house of God. Isaiah had grown up with this contradiction, and had learned, like everyone else, to simply accept it. Today, however, the noise grated against something raw in his spirit. Was this what the temple had been built for? Was this the worship that the Almighty desired? The question surfaced unbidden, and sank again beneath the weight of tradition. This was how things were done. This was how things had always been done. He moved deeper into the complex, leaving the commercial chaos behind, entering the court of Israel where Jewish men gathered for prayer and ceremony. The space was quieter here, more focused, the architecture itself seeming to demand reverence. Massive pillars supported covered walkways along the perimeter, their shadows providing relief from the sun. The stones beneath his feet had been worn smooth by generations of sandals, each surface a testament to the countless worshippers who had stood in this very place, bringing their hopes and fears and questions to the God who had chosen to make his name dwell here. The smell of incense reached him first, that distinctive fragrance of the temple, the carefully prescribed blend of stacte and onycha and galbanum and frankincense that was reserved exclusively for sacred use. The scent triggered memories that stretched back to his earliest childhood, being carried in his father's arms through these same courts, watching wide-eyed as priests performed rituals he was too young to understand, feeling the strange mixture of comfort and awe that the temple evoked in those who'd been raised within its shadow. The incense was the smell of holiness itself, or at least the closest approximation that human senses could perceive. It spoke of something set apart, something other, something that belonged to a realm beyond the ordinary transactions of daily life. Sunlight cut through the open spaces at sharp angles, illuminating columns of smoke that rose from the altar of burnt offering in the priest's court beyond. Isaiah could not see the altar itself from where he stood. That was reserved for the Levites and the sons of Aaron, but he could see the smoke ascending, could watch it rise and disperse into the blue sky above, carrying with it the prayers and offerings of the people. How many animals had been slaughtered on that altar since Solomon's dedication? How much blood had been poured out at its base? The numbers were beyond calculation, a river of sacrifice flowing across the centuries, each offering an acknowledgement that something was broken between humanity and God, each death a temporary bridge across an otherwise uncrossable chasm. The murmur of worshippers surrounded him, voices lifted in prayer, in recitation of psalms, in the private conversations that people have with God when they think no one else is listening. An old man near the wall swayed back and forth, his lips moving silently, his eyes closed, his face marked by the kind of earnestness that suggested he was wrestling with something too important for words. A group of younger men stood together discussing some point of law, their debate animated but hushed, conducted with the awareness that this was not a place for raised voices. A woman, visible at the edge of her own court beyond the barrier, wept quietly, her shoulders shaking, her grief too large for the space that contained it. Isaiah found a place along one of the colonnades where he could stand without drawing attention, where he could simply be present in the space without needing to perform any particular religious function. He was not here to offer a sacrifice today, not here to fulfill any ritual obligation. He was here because he had nowhere else to go, because the temple was the only place he knew where the questions that haunted him might find some kind of answer. He was here because when everything else was uncertain, this place at least was solid, was ancient, was real in a way that the shifting politics of the royal court could never be. The weight of history pressed down on him from every stone. Here, in this very temple, Solomon had prayed his great prayer of dedication, asking God to hear the cries of his people whenever they turned toward this place. Here, the Ark of the Covenant had been carried with trembling reverence into the Holy of Holies, where it presumably still rested behind the veil. That gold-covered chest containing the tablets of the law, the jar of manna, the rod of Aaron that had budded. Here kings had been crowned and prophets had spoken, and the destiny of the nation had been shaped by moments of faithfulness and unfaithfulness, obedience and rebellion, blessing and judgment. And here, not so many years ago, Uzziah had overreached. Isaiah had been younger then, but he remembered the scandal, the shock that had rippled through Jerusalem when the news spread. The king, their strong, successful, beloved king, struck with leprosy in the temple itself, driven out by priests who had found the courage to resist royal presumption, condemned to isolation for the rest of his life. The lesson had been clear. Not even kings could violate the holiness of God with impunity. The boundary between human ambition and divine prerogative was real, and crossing it carried consequences that no amount of power could deflect. Isaiah's mind churned with the implications of that memory as he stood in the colonnade's shadow. Uzziah had been a good king by most measures. He had strengthened the nation, expanded its borders, built its infrastructure, organized its defenses. He had done what kings were supposed to do, led his people with competence and courage. And yet, in one moment of pride, he had undone himself. One step too far, one boundary ignored, one act of presumption, and everything changed. If such a fate could befall Uzziah, what hope did anyone have? What standard of righteousness could possibly be maintained when even the best of men fell so catastrophically short? The question spiraled outward from Uzziah to the nation as a whole. Judah was not what it should be. Isaiah knew this in his bones. The worship that surrounded him in this very temple was often sincere, but it was also often hollow, performed out of habit rather than conviction, offered with hands that would return to injustice as soon as the rituals were complete. The prophets of the past had spoken against exactly this kind of empty religion, had thundered that God desired mercy rather than sacrifice, that he took no pleasure in burnt offerings when they came from hearts that oppressed the poor and perverted justice. Had anything changed since Amos had pronounced his indictments against Israel? Had anything improved since Hosea had wept over a nation that had forgotten its God? And beyond Judah's internal corruption loomed the external threat that everyone tried not to think about. The Assyrian armies were not a rumour or a distant concern. They were a present reality, already swallowing kingdoms, already demonstrating a capacity for violence that defied comprehension. The reports that filtered down from the north described atrocities designed to terrorize, mass executions, flayings, impalings, entire populations deported to distant corners of the empire never to return. These were not exaggerations. These were facts, documented in Assyrian records with a pride that made them all the more horrifying. And this empire was growing stronger, expanding westward, drawing closer with every passing year. What did God intend for his people? Would he protect Jerusalem as he had protected it in the past, when Sennacherib's armies would one day surround its walls and then mysteriously withdraw? Or would he allow the same fate that was already overtaking the northern kingdom, conquest, deportation, the end of everything Israel had been and hoped to be? The covenant promised blessing for obedience and cursing for disobedience. Which side of that equation was Judah standing on? And was there still time to change? Isaiah closed his eyes and tried to pray, but the words would not come. His mind was too crowded with questions, his heart too heavy with fears he could not name. He had been taught to pray since childhood, had memorized the psalms and the blessings and the traditional forms of address. But in this moment, all the familiar language felt inadequate, like trying to empty an ocean with a cup. What could he say to a God who saw everything, who knew the corruption of the nation and the confusion of this one young man standing in his courts? What petition could possibly matter when the problems were so vast and his own understanding so small? He let the attempt at formal prayer dissolve into something more honest. Simple presence, simple openness, a heart exposed without words to whatever might come. It was not a posture of expectation. Isaiah had no reason to believe that this day would be different from any other day, that his temple visit would produce anything more than the familiar mix of comfort and confusion that such visits always produced. He was not seeking a vision. He was not asking for a calling. He was simply there, standing in the only place that felt solid, breathing the incense-laden air, listening to the murmur of prayers around him, waiting without knowing what he was waiting for. The afternoon light shifted as the sun moved across the sky, shadows lengthening, the quality of illumination changing from the harsh brightness of midday to something softer, more golden. The temple courts began to empty as worshippers completed their business and returned to their homes and their work. The commercial noise from the outer gates faded to a distant murmur. Even the priest's movement seemed to slow, the rhythm of the temple settling into the quieter patterns of late afternoon. Isaiah remained. Something held him in place. Not a voice, not a vision, not anything he could have identified or explained. Just a sense that he should stay, that leaving now would be wrong in some way he could not articulate. He had come seeking clarity and had found only more questions. He had come hoping for direction and had received only silence. But the silence itself felt different now, charged with something that might have been his imagination, or might have been something else entirely. The temple had witnessed many things over its 2.5 centuries of existence. It had seen faithfulness and failure, glory and degradation, moments when the presence of God seemed almost tangible, and long stretches when heaven appeared utterly distant. It had been the stage for countless private dramas, countless individual encounters between human need and divine mystery. Most of those encounters left no trace in the historical record. Ordinary prayers from ordinary people, absorbed into the stones like water into sand. But this encounter would be different. This afternoon would become one of the most significant moments in the history of prophetic literature, remembered and studied and wondered at for 3,000 years and counting. The young man standing quietly in the colonnade's shadow had no way of knowing what was about to happen to him. He only knew that he was tired and confused and frightened for his nation, and desperately hoping that somewhere behind the veil, behind the smoke, behind the rituals and the traditions and the unanswered questions, God was real, and God was present, and God had not abandoned his people. The air seemed to thicken, the sounds of the temple seemed to fade, and in the space between one breath and the next, the boundary between earth and heaven began to dissolve. What Isaiah saw next would mark him forever, would reshape his understanding of everything he thought he knew about God and humanity and the terrible, beautiful space between them. The vision was coming, not because he had earned it or sought it or prepared himself adequately to receive it. It was coming because God had chosen this moment, this man, this hour, when a nation trembled and a king lay dying and a young heart stood open in the courts of the Lord. The earthly temple was about to become a window into the heavenly throne room, and Isaiah, son of Amoz, was about to see the Lord. It began not with a sound, but with a shift, a subtle alteration in the quality of reality itself, as though the fabric of the world had been pulled slightly aside to reveal something that had always been there, hidden just beneath the surface of ordinary perception. Isaiah had not moved from his place in the colonnade. His feet still stood on the worn stones of the temple court. His lungs still drew the incense-laden air of Jerusalem. But somewhere in the space between his physical senses and his spiritual awareness, a door had opened that he had not known existed. The familiar architecture of Solomon's temple seemed to expand, to deepen, to become simultaneously itself and something infinitely greater. The columns that had been hewn from Lebanese cedar now appeared to stretch upward beyond any height that human builders could have achieved, rising into distances that defied measurement. The ceiling that had been constructed by craftsmen's hands now opened into spaces that no craftsman had ever touched. The boundaries that separated the earthly sanctuary from whatever lay beyond it grew thin, transparent, and then dissolved entirely. And then Isaiah saw him. The Lord sat upon a throne, high and exalted. The words would later prove inadequate when Isaiah tried to record them, when he sat with stylus and scroll, attempting to capture in human language what human language was never designed to contain. High and exalted, the phrase gestured toward a reality it could not encompass, like a child's drawing attempting to represent the sun. The throne rose above everything, above the temple courts and the city walls and the Judean hills and the nations beyond them, above the earth itself and the heavens that covered it. This was not a king among kings, not a god among gods in the manner of the pagan pantheons. This was sovereignty itself, authority in its purest and most absolute form, power that did not derive from any source but simply was, eternal and uncreated and utterly beyond challenge. The train of his robe filled the temple. Isaiah's eyes, struggling to process what they were witnessing, fixed on this detail as though it were something his mind could hold. Fabric, that was comprehensible. Robes were familiar. Kings wore robes, and the length of a robe indicated the wearer's status. The trailing fabric a symbol of majesty that required attendants to manage and spaces large enough to accommodate. But this robe did not merely trail behind its wearer. It filled the entire temple, cascading down from the throne in waves of glory, covering the floor and the walls and the sacred spaces that Isaiah had walked through just moments before. The Holy of Holies, the inner court, the outer court, the colonnades where he had stood with his unanswered questions, all of it was covered, claimed, filled with the presence of the one who sat above. The sight should have been beautiful, and it was beautiful. But beauty was not the primary quality that registered in Isaiah's overwhelmed consciousness. The primary quality was otherness. This was not a human king magnified. This was not an earthly glory amplified to divine proportions. This was something categorically different from anything Isaiah had ever experienced or imagined. something that belonged to a realm of existence that operated by different rules entirely. The God of Israel was not simply greater than other beings, he was other than other beings, set apart in a way that made all comparisons inadequate. Above the throne, attending the one who sat upon it, Isaiah saw the seraphim. The word meant burning ones, and the name proved terrifyingly appropriate. These were not the gentle angels of later artistic imagination, not the soft-featured messengers with feathered wings and benevolent expressions. These were creatures of fire and glory, beings whose very existence seemed to radiate an intensity that made looking at them difficult, whose forms spoke of power restrained rather than power domesticated. They hovered in the air above the throne, their movements suggesting both perfect coordination and perfect freedom, servants who served not from compulsion but from the overflow of adoration. Each seraph had 6 wings, and the arrangement of those wings told its own story about what it meant to exist in the presence of absolute holiness. With 2 wings they covered their faces. Even these glorious beings, these creatures of the heavenly court, could not gaze directly upon the one they served. The radiance was too great, the holiness too intense, the purity too absolute for even angelic eyes to behold uncovered. With 2 wings they covered their feet, a gesture of humility, of unworthiness, an acknowledgement that even the highest servants of heaven approached their Lord with reverence rather than presumption. And with 2 wings they flew, suspended in the air of the throne room, positioned to move instantly in whatever direction their service might require. Then the seraphim began to cry out, and their voices shook the universe. They called to one another in antiphonal praise, one voice answering another in a pattern that had no beginning Isaiah could detect, and would have no end he could imagine. The words were simple, devastatingly, overwhelmingly simple, yet they carried a weight that made the foundations of the temple tremble. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. The threefold repetition was not accident or mere emphasis. In Hebrew expression, repetition intensified meaning, and threefold repetition indicated the superlative degree. To say something once was to state it. To say it twice was to confirm it. To say it 3 times was to declare it absolute, ultimate, beyond any possibility of increase. The seraphim were not simply noting that God possessed the quality of holiness. They were proclaiming that he was holiness itself, the source and standard and definition of the concept. Holy, beyond holy, in an infinite regression that human minds could not follow. The word itself, kadosh in Hebrew, carried connotations that English translations only partially captured. Holiness meant set apart, other, different in kind rather than merely different in degree. A holy object was not simply a clean object that had been cleaned more thoroughly. It was an object that had been removed from ordinary use and dedicated to sacred purpose. A holy day was not simply a good day or a special day. It was a day that operated by different rules, that belonged to a different category of time. And a holy God was not simply a powerful deity or a righteous ruler. He was the one who existed in a realm of purity so absolute that everything else, by comparison, was contaminated. The voices of the seraphim rolled through the throne room like thunder, like the sound of many waters, like the roar of a great wind and the crackling of infinite fire combined into a single overwhelming proclamation. The doorposts and thresholds shook at the sound, not symbolically, not metaphorically, but actually trembled as the physical structure of the temple responded to the spiritual reality being declared within it. The building that had seemed so solid, so permanent, so massive in its construction of stone and cedar, now revealed itself as fragile, temporary, barely able to contain the edges of a glory that exceeded all containment. Smoke filled the temple, it billowed from no visible source, yet it was everywhere. Not the thin wisps that rose from the incense altar, but dense clouds that obscured vision and transformed the throne room into a space of mystery as much as revelation. The smoke spoke of the hidden nature of God even in the midst of his self-disclosure. Isaiah was being shown more than any mortal had a right to see, yet even now, even in vision, the fullness of the divine nature remained veiled. God revealed himself truly but not exhaustively. What Isaiah witnessed was real but partial, an accommodation to human capacity rather than a complete unveiling of infinite reality. And Isaiah, what of Isaiah through all of this? The young man who had entered the temple courts with his questions and his fears, his political anxieties and his spiritual longings, his noble birth and his educated mind. That young man had ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. Everything that had defined him, everything he had thought he knew about himself and his world, had been swept away by the flood of glory that now surrounded him. He was no longer a thinker thinking thoughts about God. He was a creature in the presence of his Creator, a speck of dust before the whirlwind, a candle flame in the presence of the sun. The questions he had brought into the temple about Uzziah's fate and Judah's future and the Assyrian threat and the corruption of the nation, these questions did not so much receive answers as become irrelevant. They were not wrong questions, but they were small questions. Questions that assumed a framework of understanding that had just been shattered beyond repair. Standing in the presence of the Holy One, Isaiah could not think about politics or strategy or even personal destiny. He could only experience, only receive, only endure the weight of a glory that pressed down upon him with an intensity that threatened to unmake him entirely. This was what the patriarchs had feared when they spoke of seeing God and dying. This was what Moses had been protected from when God placed him in the cleft of the rock and covered him with his hand, allowing only his back to be seen as he passed by. This was why the high priest entered the Holy of Holies only once a year, and only with blood, and only with bells on his garments so that those outside could hear if he was still moving, still alive, still surviving the encounter with the presence that dwelt above the mercy seat. The holiness of God was not a comfortable doctrine or a theological abstraction. It was a consuming fire, and those who drew near to it understood that they did so at the risk of their very existence. The seraphim continued their cry, the endless antiphon that had begun before time and would continue after time's end. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty! The whole earth is full of His glory! The words washed over Isaiah in waves, each repetition driving deeper into his consciousness the reality they proclaimed. The whole earth was full of His glory, not would be full someday, not should be full in principle, but was full already, in present tense, in actual fact. The glory that Isaiah now witnessed in concentrated form was the same glory that permeated all creation, hidden in plain sight, present in every sunrise and every thunderstorm and every human face, visible to those with eyes to see. But Isaiah's eyes were seeing something else now. As the glory of God filled his vision, another sight was emerging. A sight he had not anticipated, had not sought, would not have chosen if he had understood what was coming. The light that revealed God's holiness was also revealing something about Isaiah himself. The same radiance that made the seraphim cover their faces was now falling upon the young man from Jerusalem, illuminating not just the throne room of heaven but the hidden chambers of his own heart. What he saw there would break him. The vision was not finished. The worst, or perhaps the best, was yet to come. Isaiah had seen the Lord, high and exalted, attended by burning ones, proclaimed by voices that shook the foundations of existence. He had glimpsed a holiness beyond his capacity to comprehend. And now that holiness was turning toward him, not in wrath, but in truth, preparing to show him what he looked like when measured against the only standard that ultimately mattered. The seraphim cried, "Holy." The smoke swirled, the threshold trembled, and Isaiah, son of Amoz, stood exposed in the light of glory, with nowhere to hide and no words to speak except the ones that were about to tear themselves from his lips in the most honest prayer he had ever prayed. The cry that escaped Isaiah's lips was not planned. It was not composed or considered or crafted with the rhetorical skill that would later characterize his prophetic oracles. It was torn from him, wrenched from the deepest places of his being by a force he could neither resist nor control. The words came out raw, ragged, carrying the weight of a revelation that had shattered every illusion he had ever maintained about himself. "Woe is me!" The phrase was not unfamiliar to him. Prophets spoke woe oracles against cities and nations, pronouncing divine judgment on those who had violated God's law. Isaiah himself would later speak such oracles. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes. Woe to those who join house to house and field to field. These were words of condemnation, verdicts rendered against the guilty, sentences pronounced by heaven's court upon those who deserved destruction. And now Isaiah was speaking a woe oracle against himself. The irony cut deep. He had entered the temple that day burdened by the sins of others, the corruption of Jerusalem's elite, the hollow worship of the nation, the injustice that permeated Judean society. He had carried moral clarity about everyone else's failures. He had seen so clearly what was wrong with his people, had felt so keenly the gap between what Judah professed and what Judah practiced. But now, in the light of absolute holiness, that moral clarity had turned inward with devastating precision. The accuser had become the accused. The one who saw others' sins now saw his own, and what he saw left him undone. "I am ruined!" The Hebrew word carried connotations of destruction, of being cut off, of disintegration and annihilation. It was the language of catastrophe, the vocabulary of endings. Isaiah was not exaggerating for effect. He was reporting what felt like literal reality. In the presence of perfect holiness, his own existence felt like an offence, a contamination, something that could not and should not continue. He was coming apart, dissolving, being unmade by an encounter with purity so absolute that impurity could not survive in its presence. This was not false humility. False humility was a performance for other people, a show of modesty designed to elicit reassurance or admiration. What Isaiah experienced in the throne room was the opposite of performance. It was the stripping away of all performance, the removal of every mask and every pretense, the exposure of truth so complete that nothing could be hidden. He was not telling the seraphim how unworthy he felt in hopes that they would contradict him. He was simply reporting what the light had revealed. He was ruined, destroyed, undone. "For I am a man of unclean lips." The confession grew specific, and its specificity revealed something profound about how Isaiah understood his own failure. Of all the sins he might have named, of all the ways he might have characterized his unworthiness, he chose this one: unclean lips. The phrase pointed to speech, to words, to the power that flowed through human language. Isaiah was a man of words, educated, articulate, trained in the verbal arts that characterized his social class. He had used words all his life, deploying them to persuade and impress and achieve his purposes. And now, in the presence of the one whose word had called creation into existence, Isaiah understood that his own words were contaminated at their source. The uncleanness was not merely about lying, though lies were surely part of it. It was about the entire relationship between his heart and his speech, about the gap between what he said and what he meant, about the ways language could be used to manipulate rather than illuminate. Every word of flattery he had ever spoken, every half-truth he had allowed to stand, every time he had remained silent when justice demanded that he speak, all of it was exposed now, gathered together under the judgment of unclean lips. His very medium of communication, the instrument through which he engaged with the world, was defiled. But the confession did not stop with himself, and I dwell among a people of unclean lips. Isaiah's personal guilt was not isolated. It was woven into the fabric of a community, a nation, a people whose collective speech was as contaminated as his own. He was not a righteous man living among sinners. He was a sinner living among sinners, shaped by their sins, participating in their guilt, unable to separate himself from the culture of uncleanness that surrounded him. The distance he had felt from his people, that sense of moral superiority that had allowed him to judge their failures, collapsed in an instant. He was one of them. Their disease was his disease. Their uncleanness flowed through his own veins. This recognition prevented any possibility of self-righteousness surviving the encounter. Isaiah could not stand in the presence of God and say, "At least I'm better than they are." The holiness that exposed him exposed them all, and in that exposure, distinctions that had seemed so important before, between the righteous and the unrighteous, the faithful and the unfaithful, the reformer and the corrupt, simply vanished. Before this throne, there was only one category of human being: unclean. The gradations that humans used to rank themselves against each other meant nothing in the light of absolute purity. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. Here was the explanation for everything that was happening to Isaiah. He had seen what should not be seen, had witnessed what mortal eyes were not designed to witness. The King, not Uzziah lying in his isolated chamber, not Jotham managing the affairs of state, not any earthly ruler whose authority derived from human arrangements, but the King, the true sovereign, the Lord of armies and angels and all created things. Isaiah had seen him, and that seeing had become his undoing. The connection between seeing God and being destroyed was not arbitrary. It was not that God killed people capriciously for glimpsing his form. It was that holiness and unholiness could not coexist, that light and darkness could not occupy the same space, that the presence of infinite purity necessarily exposed and judged everything impure that came near it. Isaiah was being destroyed not by divine malice but by divine nature. He was a shadow being dispelled by the sun, a drop of contaminated water being evaporated by the heat of absolute flame. To see the Holy One while remaining unholy was simply impossible. Something had to give. The emotional dimensions of this experience exceeded anything Isaiah had ever felt or imagined. There was fear, certainly, the primal terror of a creature encountering a power that could unmake it without effort. But fear was only part of the complex storm that tore through him. There was grief, profound, wrenching sorrow at the recognition of what he had been, what he had done, what he had failed to be. The young man who had thought himself spiritually sensitive, morally aware, dedicated to justice and truth, now saw that his best efforts had been contaminated from the start, that his very sensitivity had been a form of pride, that his moral clarity about others had been a way of avoiding moral clarity about himself. There was shame, the exposure of nakedness before an audience that could not be deceived or distracted. Every secret thought, every hidden motivation, every moment when Isaiah had chosen comfort over courage or approval over integrity, all of it lay open before the throne, known completely, judged accurately. He could not justify himself because there was no justification available. He could not explain his failures in ways that made them understandable, because understanding did not change their character. He was what he was, and what he was could not stand in this place. And beneath the fear and grief and shame there was something else, something that Isaiah would only be able to name later. When distance had given him perspective on what he had experienced, there was awe, there was wonder, there was a strange, terrible, beautiful recognition that this was the truth he had been searching for, that this encounter, however devastating, was more real than anything else he had ever experienced. The holiness that destroyed him was also the holiness that gave existence meaning. The God who exposed his sin was also the God who had created him, sustained him, drawn him to the temple on this particular day. Isaiah was being unmade, but he was being unmade by love as much as by judgment. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Isaiah remained in his posture of collapse, his cry of woe still echoing in the throne room, his confession hanging in the incense thick air. The seraphim continued their antiphon, "Holy, holy, holy," the words now sounding like both verdict and invitation. The Lord remained on his throne, high and exalted, his robe filling the temple, his presence filling the universe, his holiness filling every corner of reality with a light that nothing could escape. What could possibly come next? Isaiah had no category for what might follow his confession. In human courts, confession led to sentencing, and sentences in capital cases led to execution. If seeing God meant death, and if Isaiah had indeed seen God, then death was what he should expect. Perhaps the seraphim would descend upon him with destroying fire. Perhaps the smoke would consume him where he lay. Perhaps he would simply cease to exist, his contaminated presence erased from the holy space he had no right to occupy. He waited for judgment. He waited for the end. He had spoken the truest words he had ever spoken, had seen himself more clearly than he had ever seen himself before, and now there was nothing left to do but accept whatever consequences that clarity demanded. The young man who had climbed the temple steps that morning with questions about national destiny now lay prostrate before the throne of heaven, his questions forgotten, his identity stripped bare, his future, if he had a future, entirely outside his control. The silence after his confession was more terrible than the thunderous voices of the seraphim had been. In that silence, everything hung suspended. Isaiah's life, his calling, his very existence. He had seen the Lord. He had spoken his unworthiness. He had nothing left to offer except his presence in a place where his presence was a problem. But heaven was not finished with him. The God who had revealed his holiness was about to reveal something else, something that Isaiah could never have predicted, could never have earned, could never have achieved through any effort of his own. The throne room of judgment was about to become a throne room of grace. The fire that Isaiah feared would destroy him was about to touch him with a different purpose entirely. A seraph moved. One of those burning ones, those creatures of flame and glory, departed from its position above the throne and descended toward the broken man below. In its hand, if hand was the right word for whatever appendage it possessed, the seraph carried something that glowed with a heat beyond natural fire. It had been taken from the altar, that place of sacrifice where blood was poured out and offerings were consumed, and it came now toward Isaiah with an intention he could not yet comprehend. Mercy was approaching, but it would arrive in a form that looked, at first, like more destruction. The purification Isaiah needed would not be comfortable or gentle. It would be fire, and fire, before it purifies, must first burn. The seraph descended with a swiftness that left no time for Isaiah to brace himself, no moment of preparation between the recognition of what was coming and its arrival. The burning one crossed the space between the throne and the prostrate prophet in an instant, moving with the terrifying grace of a creature perfectly designed for its purpose. In the grip of its tongs, for the seraph had taken an instrument from beside the altar, unwilling or unable to touch directly what it now carried, a coal blazed with heat that seemed to exceed the fire from which it had been drawn. This was no ordinary ember. The altar from which it came was the altar of sacrifice, the place where the offerings of Israel were consumed by flames that represented divine acceptance. Every animal that had ever been slaughtered there, every drop of blood that had been poured out at its base, every prayer that had ascended with the smoke of burning flesh, all of it was concentrated in this single coal, this fragment of holy fire that now approached Isaiah's face with inexorable purpose. The heat reached him before the coal did, a wave of burning air that made his skin contract and his eyes water. He could not move, could not retreat, could not do anything but remain in place as the seraph brought heaven's fire to his unclean lips. The coal touched him. What Isaiah experienced in that moment defied the categories of ordinary sensation. There was pain, immense, overwhelming pain that seemed to consume not just his lips but his entire being. Fire was burning him, searing the flesh that had spoken so many contaminated words, cauterizing the source of his uncleanness with a heat that felt capable of destroying everything it touched. He should have screamed. Perhaps he did scream, though the sound was lost in the greater sounds of the throne room, swallowed by the seraphim's continuing cry of "Holy, holy, holy." The agony was absolute, admitting no distraction, demanding all of his awareness. But even as the pain flooded through him, Isaiah became aware of something else happening beneath it, something that the pain was accomplishing rather than merely causing. The fire was not simply burning him, it was burning something off of him, something away from him, something that had been attached to his being for so long that he had forgotten it was there. The contamination that had accumulated across a lifetime of unclean speech, the lies and half-truths, the flattery and manipulation, the silences when he should have spoken, and the words when he should have remained silent, all of it was being consumed in the holy flame. The fire was not destroying Isaiah, it was destroying what was destroying Isaiah. The seraph spoke, and its voice carried an authority that Isaiah had not heard, even in the thunderous cry of praise that had shaken the throne room's foundations. This was not the corporate proclamation of holiness. This was direct address, personal communication, a word spoken to Isaiah alone in the midst of his agony. "See, this has touched your lips." The statement was simple, almost obvious. Of course the coal had touched his lips. He was experiencing that touch with every nerve in his body. But the seraph was not merely narrating what had happened. It was interpreting it. explaining the meaning of the fire that still burned against Isaiah's mouth. The touch was not punishment. It was not the execution that Isaiah had expected when he saw the seraph descending. It was something else entirely, something that the next words would make explicit. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. The declaration landed with a force that exceeded even the impact of the coal itself. Your guilt is taken away. The Hebrew pointed to removal, to lifting off, to the complete separation of something that had been attached. The guilt that had pressed down on Isaiah since the moment he first saw the throne. The guilt that had intensified with every cry of holy from the seraphim, that had become unbearable when he recognized his own unclean lips and his place among an unclean people. That guilt was gone. Not forgiven in the sense of being overlooked or excused, but taken away. Removed as completely as the coal had removed whatever impurity it had burned from his flesh, and your sin atoned for. The word carried sacrificial weight, pointing to the covering and cancellation that occurred when blood was shed on the altar, when life was given to deal with the offence that separated humanity from God. Isaiah had not brought a sacrifice to the temple that day. He had not slaughtered a lamb or poured out blood at the altar's base. Yet atonement had been accomplished, not through his own offering but through heaven's initiative, not through anything Isaiah had done but through something done to him. The fire that burned him was the fire of the altar, and the altar was the place of atonement. What the sacrificial system pointed toward had been accomplished in a single searing moment of direct divine intervention. The pain began to recede. It did not disappear entirely. Isaiah would carry the memory of that burning for the rest of his life, but it softened from agony into something more like the ache of healing, the sensation of a wound being closed rather than opened. The seraph withdrew, returning to its position above the throne, its mission complete. The tongs that had held the coal were empty now. Whatever fire had touched Isaiah remained with him, but it no longer burned. It had done its work. Slowly, hesitantly, Isaiah began to rise. The movement was not confident. He was not springing to his feet with renewed energy, not leaping up in celebration of his cleansing. He was lifting himself carefully, testing whether existence was still possible in this place, where he had felt so certain of his own destruction. His body responded to his will. His limbs supported his weight. He was alive, still alive, in the presence of the Holy One, no longer being destroyed by what he saw. The change in his internal state was harder to describe than the change in his physical position, but it was far more profound. The crushing weight of guilt that had pressed him to the ground was gone. The terror that had accompanied his exposure before the throne had transformed into something else. Not confidence exactly, not comfort, but a kind of settled assurance that he was permitted to be here, that his presence was no longer an offence, that the holiness that filled the temple no longer threatened his existence. He could look toward the throne without feeling that looking would annihilate him. He could breathe the smoke-filled air without choking on his own unworthiness. Grace had accomplished what effort never could. Isaiah had not purified himself. He had not meditated or prayed or performed rituals until his uncleanness gradually diminished. He had simply confessed, had simply acknowledged what was true about himself, and heaven had responded with fire that healed rather than destroyed. The purification was a gift entirely unearned, received in a posture of complete helplessness. Isaiah had contributed nothing to his own cleansing except his presence and his honesty. Everything else had come from the throne. This was the mystery at the heart of Israel's sacrificial system, the truth that the blood of bulls and goats had always pointed toward, but could never fully accomplish. Atonement was God's work, not humanity's. The offerings that Israel brought to the altar were not payments that purchased forgiveness. They were responses to a grace that had already decided to forgive. The entire elaborate system of priests and sacrifices and holy days existed because God had chosen to make a way for unclean people to approach his holiness, not because unclean people had discovered a method for cleaning themselves. Isaiah, standing now in the throne room with his guilt removed and his sin atoned, understood this truth experientially in a way that no amount of theological instruction could have conveyed. The seraphim still cried their endless antiphon, but the words sounded different now. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. Before, These words had been verdict, exposure, the relentless proclamation of a standard Isaiah could never meet. Now they were something else, description, celebration, an invitation to join in the wonder of a holiness that could purify as well as judge. The same God who was holy beyond comprehension was also the God who had sent the seraph with the coal. The same holiness that had undone Isaiah had also remade him. These were not contradictions, but complementary aspects of a single divine nature, severity and kindness flowing from the same source. Isaiah stood in the space he had thought would kill him, breathing air he had thought would scorch his lungs, looking toward a throne he had thought would blind him. He was transformed, not into something other than human, not into a being of fire like the seraphim, but into a human who had been touched by heaven and lived to tell of it. His lips, which had been the specific site of his confession and his cleansing, now felt different, set apart, consecrated, prepared for some purpose he did not yet understand. The unclean lips had become clean lips. The mouth that had spoken contamination was now ready to speak something else. What that something else might be, Isaiah did not know. He had not come to the temple seeking a calling. He had not expected to leave with a commission. He had simply come with questions and received instead an encounter that had answered questions he had not known enough to ask. But standing now in the aftermath of fire with the weight of guilt removed and the reality of grace settled into his bones, Isaiah sensed that the encounter was not yet complete. Heaven had cleansed him. Surely heaven had a reason. The throne room had grown quiet, not silent, for the seraphim never ceased their praise, but quieter, as though creation itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what would come next. The smoke still swirled, the foundations still trembled with the echoes of holy, holy, holy. The Lord still sat upon his throne, high and exalted, his robe still filling the temple, his presence still permeating every corner of the space. But now there was an openness in the atmosphere, an expectation, a sense that something was about to be spoken that had not yet been spoken. Isaiah waited. He had learned, in the span of this single encounter, that waiting was sometimes the only appropriate response to the divine presence. He had rushed into the temple with his anxieties and his questions. He had been broken by holiness, purified by fire, and restored by grace. Now he simply waited, standing on legs that still trembled, breathing with lungs that still remembered the smoke, watching with eyes that had seen more than they were designed to see. The voice, when it came, would change everything. The question it posed would demand an answer. And the answer Isaiah gave would echo through centuries, inspiring prophets and martyrs, missionaries and reformers, anyone who had ever heard heaven's call and been faced with the choice of whether to respond. The cleansed prophet stood ready. The moment of calling was at hand. The voice that broke the expectant silence was unlike the voices of the seraphim, though it shared their authority and exceeded their power. Where the burning ones cried out to one another in antiphonal praise, this voice spoke from the throne itself, carrying a weight that made even the seraphim's thunderous proclamations seem like whispers by comparison. It was the voice that had spoken creation into existence, that had called Abraham from Ur and Moses from the burning bush, that had thundered from Sinai and whispered to Elijah in the cave. It was the voice of the Lord Almighty, and it was asking a question: whom shall I send, and who will go for us? The question hung in the throne room like lightning frozen in the moment before it strikes. Isaiah heard it with his newly cleansed ears, felt it resonate in his newly purified heart, understood it with a clarity that would have been impossible just moments before. God was looking for someone. The sovereign Lord of the universe, surrounded by seraphim who would execute any command instantaneously, possessing power that could accomplish any purpose without human assistance, was asking who would go on his behalf. It was, on its face, absurd. The one who needed nothing was expressing need. The one who could command was choosing to invite. The plural pronoun caught Isaiah's attention even in the overwhelming rush of the moment. Who will go for us? It echoed the language of creation, when God had said, "Let us make man in our image," pointing toward mysteries of divine nature that Isaiah could not fully comprehend. The seraphim, perhaps. The heavenly council, possibly. Or something deeper still, some plurality within the unity of the one God that human categories could not contain. Whatever the pronoun meant, it invested the question with an authority that transcended any single messenger. This was not merely God seeking an errand runner. This was the throne room of heaven issuing a summons that would carry the full weight of divine purpose. But the question itself was what demanded response. Whom shall I send? The emphasis fell on willingness rather than qualification. God was not asking who was worthy. Isaiah had just demonstrated conclusively that he was not worthy, that no human could be worthy, that worthiness in the presence of absolute holiness was an impossible standard. God was not asking who was capable. The mission, whatever it might be, would be accomplished by divine power working through human frailty, not by human strength operating independently. God was asking who was willing, who would go, who would accept the commission, who would step forward when stepping forward meant entering a story whose ending they could not control. The question implied something remarkable about how God had chosen to operate in the world. He did not simply impose his will by force, did not conscript messengers without their consent, did not override human choice in the service of divine purpose. He invited, he asked, he waited for response. The seraphim could have been dispatched to deliver any message God wanted delivered. Angels could have written words across the sky, or thundered pronouncements from the clouds. But God wanted human voices to carry his words to human ears. He wanted people who had experienced his holiness and survived his grace to speak to other people about what they had seen and heard. The method was inefficient, prone to failure, dependent on frail and fallible vessels. And yet, it was God's chosen method, the way he had worked since calling Abraham, the pattern he would continue until the end of time. Isaiah did not hesitate. The young man who had entered the temple that morning with questions and fears, who had been crushed by holiness and burned by purifying fire, who had received grace he had not sought, and forgiveness he could not earn, that young man opened his mouth and spoke the words that would define the rest of his existence. Here am I, send me. 4 words in English, 3 in Hebrew, hineni, shelachini. The brevity was striking, especially from a man who would later produce some of the most elaborate and beautiful poetry in the Hebrew language. Isaiah did not ask for clarification about the mission. He did not negotiate terms or request details. He did not inquire about compensation or duration or the likelihood of success. He simply offered himself, his presence, his willingness, his newly cleansed lips ready to speak whatever words God would give him to speak. Hineni, here am I. The word carried resonance from Israel's past. Abraham had spoken it when God called him to sacrifice Isaac. Jacob had spoken it when the angel appeared in his dream. Moses had spoken it at the burning bush. It was the response of those who understood that when God spoke, the only appropriate answer was availability. Not, here am I and here are my conditions. Not, here am I, but first let me understand what you're asking. Simply, hineni. I am present, I am attentive, I am yours, shelakeni, send me. The word moved from availability to commission, from passive presence to active engagement. Isaiah was not merely acknowledging that God had spoken. He was volunteering for whatever assignment the speaking entailed. He was stepping forward into a future he could not see, accepting a mission he did not yet understand, committing himself to a purpose that would be revealed only as he walked in obedience. The question had been, who will go? And Isaiah answered by asking to be the one sent. The response emerged from a heart that had been transformed by the encounter. Before the vision, Isaiah might have hesitated. He might have weighed the costs, considered the implications, wondered whether he was really the right person for divine work. His questions about the nation, his fears about the Assyrians, his concerns about Judah's spiritual condition, these would have created obstacles, reasons to pause, grounds for requesting more information before committing. But the Isaiah who stood in the throne room now was not the Isaiah who had climbed the temple steps that morning. He had seen the Lord. He had been undone and remade. He had experienced grace that burned away not only his guilt but also his hesitation. What remained was simple willingness, uncomplicated availability, the response of a man who understood that he had been purified for a purpose and was ready to discover what that purpose was. God did not leave him wondering long. The commission came immediately after the acceptance, and its contents were unlike anything Isaiah could have expected. Go and tell this people, be ever hearing but never understanding, be ever seeing but never perceiving. Make the heart of this people calloused, make their ears dull and close their eyes, otherwise they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn and be healed. The words were devastating. Isaiah had volunteered for a mission, and the mission was to preach to a people who would not respond. He was being sent not to a harvest ready for gathering, but to a field that would refuse to yield. His preaching would not open ears, it would contribute to their closing. His proclamation would not soften hearts, it would accelerate their hardening. The very success of his mission would be measured not by converts won or revivals sparked, but by the documented refusal of those who heard to respond to what they were hearing. This was not the calling Isaiah might have imagined in his most ambitious dreams. He had walked into the temple burdened by Judah's spiritual condition, grieved by the gap between what the nation professed and what it practiced. If he had allowed himself to imagine divine commissioning, he might have pictured himself as the voice that would finally break through, the prophet whose words would spark the reformation that others had failed to achieve. Instead, God was telling him that his words would meet resistance, that his faithfulness would not be rewarded with visible results, that he would spend his life speaking truths that his audience would refuse to hear. The logic behind this commission was not immediately apparent, but it pointed towards something profound about divine justice. A people who had been given every advantage, the law, the prophets, the temple, the covenant, and who had still turned away could not claim ignorance when judgment came. Isaiah's preaching would remove any excuse. Every word he spoke would be a witness against those who refused to respond, documentation that God had continued to reach out even when his people continued to pull away. The hardening that Isaiah's message would accomplish was not arbitrary divine cruelty. It was the natural consequence of persistent rejection, the spiritual callousness that developed when truth was repeatedly heard and repeatedly ignored. Isaiah received this difficult commission and did not withdraw his offer. He might have. He might have said, "I volunteered for success, not failure. Send someone else to preside over spiritual decline. Let me be the prophet who sees revival, not the prophet who announces judgment." But the man who had spoken Hineni, Shelashini, did not add conditions after the fact. He had offered himself without reservation, and he would serve without reservation, even if service meant a lifetime of apparent futility. But the commission was not complete. Isaiah, perhaps sensing that the word of judgment could not be God's final word, asked the question that any prophet would ask, the question that revealed his heart for the people he would be sent to address. "For how long, Lord?" It was a cry for mercy disguised as a request for information. How long would the hardening continue? How long would ears remain closed and hearts remain calloused? Was there any limit to the judgment, any horizon beyond which hope might be visible? Isaiah had accepted the mission of preaching to the unresponsive, but he could not accept that unresponsiveness was permanent. Somewhere in the divine plan there had to be a turning point, a moment when the pattern would shift and the words he spoke would finally find fertile soil. God's answer was sobering and specific. Until the cities lie ruined and without inhabitant, until the houses are left deserted and the fields ruined and ravaged, until the Lord has sent everyone far away and the land is utterly forsaken. The judgment would continue until it had run its full course, until the consequences of the nation's choices had worked themselves out in exile and devastation, until the land that had been promised to Abraham lay empty of Abraham's descendants, until everything that could be stripped away had been stripped away. Isaiah would not see revival in his lifetime. He would see decline, invasion, the beginning of catastrophes that would culminate generations after his death. His ministry would span the reigns of 4 kings, and through all of it the trajectory would be downward. And yet, and this was the thread of hope that ran through even the darkest pronouncement, judgment was not the end. But as the terebinth and oak leaf stumps when they are cut down, so the holy seed will be the stump in the land. A remnant would survive, a stump would remain. From what appeared to be total destruction, new life would eventually emerge. the holy seed, that faithful core who would hear and respond, who would preserve the truth through the years of judgment, who would carry the promise forward when everything around them suggested the promise had failed. This remnant would be the future. Isaiah's words would harden many, but they would also preserve a few. His apparently futile ministry would bear fruit he would never see, sustaining hope in hearts he would never know, keeping alive a flame that would eventually blaze into restoration. This was the calling Isaiah accepted when he said, "Here am I, send me." Not a calling to triumphant success, but to faithful presence. Not a promise of visible results, but an invitation to trust in visible purposes. He would speak because God had given him words to speak. He would continue because obedience mattered more than outcomes. He would plant seeds in rocky soil, knowing that soil conditions were not his responsibility. He would preach to closed ears, understanding that opening ears was God's work, not his. His job was to be faithful. Results belonged to the one who sat on the throne. The vision began to recede. The throne room that had opened before Isaiah's eyes began to close, the boundaries between heaven and earth reasserting themselves. The ordinary reality of the earthly temple slowly returning to replace the overwhelming reality of the divine presence. The seraphim's voices faded, though their cry of "Holy, holy, holy" would echo in Isaiah's memory forever. The smoke thinned. The trembling of the foundations settled. The young man who had been caught up into the throne room of heaven found himself standing once again in the courts of Solomon's temple, his feet on worn stones, his lungs breathing incense-laden air, his lips still burning with the memory of holy fire. But nothing was the same. Nothing could ever be the same. He had seen the Lord. He had been purified by coal from the altar. He had heard the question of heaven and spoken his answer. He was no longer merely Isaiah, son of Amoz, young man of a noble birth, citizen of Jerusalem. He was now Isaiah the prophet, commissioned by the throne room of heaven to speak words that God would give him, sent to a people who would largely refuse to hear, sustained by a vision of holiness that would never leave him. The calling had been issued. The response had been given. The mission, with all its grief and glory, was about to begin. Isaiah walked out of the temple that day into a world that looked the same but had become entirely different. The streets of Jerusalem still bustled with their ordinary commerce. The palace still housed a dying king and an anxious administration. The Assyrian threat still loomed on the horizon, and Judah's spiritual condition remained as compromised as it had been when Isaiah climbed the temple steps that morning. Nothing external had changed, but the man who now moved through these familiar surroundings had been transformed so fundamentally that he might as well have been a different person wearing the same skin. The years that followed would test every dimension of that transformation. Isaiah's ministry spanned the reigns of 4 kings, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, a period of roughly 6 decades that encompassed some of the most turbulent events in Judah's history. He would speak to monarchs and commoners, to priests and politicians, to the faithful remnant and the hardened majority. He would deliver oracles of judgment so severe that they scorched the page, and promises of hope so beautiful that they became the foundation for all subsequent messianic expectation. He would confront corruption, comfort the afflicted, and chronicle the slow collapse of a nation that refused to listen. The ministry began in earnest during the reign of Ahaz, when the crisis Isaiah had sensed approaching finally arrived in full force. The northern kingdom of Israel had allied with Aram against Judah, threatening to depose the Davidic dynasty and install a puppet king who would join their coalition against Assyria. The military situation was desperate. Jerusalem trembled. Ahaz, young and overwhelmed, considered submitting to Assyria as a vassal state rather than face the combined armies of his northern enemies. Isaiah walked into this crisis with a message from the throne room he had visited years before. He found Ahaz inspecting Jerusalem's water supply, a practical concern when siege seemed imminent, and delivered an oracle that must have seemed absurdly detached from military reality. "Be careful, keep calm, and don't be afraid," the prophet said. "Do not lose heart because of these 2 smouldering stubs of firewood." The 2 kings threatening Judah were not the raging infernos they appeared to be. They were dying embers soon to be extinguished. Their conspiracy would fail, their kingdoms would fall, Assyria would sweep them away within years, and Judah, if Judah would only trust, would survive. Then came the extraordinary offer. "Ask the Lord your God for a sign," Isaiah told the king, "whether in the deepest depths or in the highest heights." It was an open invitation to request divine confirmation. Any sign Ahaz could imagine, from the realm of the dead to the farthest reaches of heaven. God was willing to demonstrate his faithfulness in whatever way the king required. Ahaz refused, cloaking his refusal in pious language. "I will not ask, I will not put the Lord to the test." It sounded humble. It was actually defiance. The king had already decided to seek Assyria's protection rather than trust God's promise. He had already sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser with tribute and a plea for help. He did not want a sign because a sign would obligate him to a faith he had already rejected. Isaiah's response to this refusal produced one of the most significant prophecies in all of Scripture. "The Lord himself will give you a sign," the prophet declared, speaking now not just to Ahaz but to the entire house of David. "The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel." The immediate reference pointed to events in Isaiah's own time, a child who would be born before the current crisis passed, whose early years would witness the destruction of the threatening kingdoms. But the prophecy carried freight that far exceeded its immediate context. Emmanuel, God with us, a child whose very name proclaimed divine presence in human form. The words planted a seed that would germinate for 7 centuries before finding their ultimate fulfillment in another young woman. Another unexpected conception, another child born in the midst of political turmoil and failed human leadership. This was the pattern of Isaiah's prophetic ministry. Words that addressed immediate circumstances while simultaneously pointing toward realities far beyond those circumstances. He spoke to his own generation about their own crises, but his words kept opening into vistas that transcended anything his contemporaries could have imagined. The historical Isaiah became, without ceasing to be historical, a voice that spoke across centuries to situations he could not have foreseen. The Assyrian crisis that Ahaz thought he was solving by submission only deepened in the years that followed. Tiglath-Pileser did indeed destroy the coalition that threatened Judah, but the cure proved worse than the disease. The northern kingdom of Israel fell in 722 BC, its population deported, its identity as a nation erased forever. Judah survived as an Assyrian vassal, but vassalage meant tribute, accommodation, and the constant temptation to adopt the religious practices of the empire. The spiritual compromise Isaiah had grieved over before his calling only intensified under the pressure of political necessity. Through it all, the prophet spoke. He denounced the empty ritualism that substituted sacrifice for justice. "Stop bringing meaningless offerings," he thundered in God's name. "Your incense is detestable to me. New moons, Sabbaths, and convocations, I cannot bear your worthless assemblies." The problem was not the rituals themselves, but the hearts that performed them. Hands raised in prayer were hands stained with blood. Festivals observed with precision were festivals empty of genuine devotion. God wanted something different. Learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. He pronounced woe upon the wealthy who accumulated property while the poor lost everything. Woe to you who add house to house and join field to field till no space is left and you live alone in the land. The economic exploitation that concentrated resources in fewer and fewer hands was not merely a social problem. It was a spiritual rebellion, a rejection of the covenant that had bound Israel together as a community of mutual obligation. The luxury of the few was purchased by the misery of the many, and God was not indifferent to the transaction. He warned of judgment coming like a flood, like fire, like an army that would strip the land bare. The Assyrian forces that Ahaz had invited as protectors would become instruments of divine discipline, a razor hired to shave Judah clean of its pretensions. In that day the Lord will use a razor hired from beyond the Euphrates River, the king of Assyria, to shave your head and private parts, and to cut off your beard also. The imagery was deliberately humiliating, stripping away the symbols of dignity and status, reducing the proud nation to naked vulnerability. Yet woven through every oracle of judgment, sometimes in the same breath that announced destruction, Isaiah spoke words of hope that seemed almost impossible given the circumstances. A remnant would return, A shoot would spring from the stump of Jesse. A child would be born whose government would rest on his shoulders, whose names would be Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. The throne of David, which seemed so precarious under Ahaz and his successors, would be established forever under a ruler whose reign would know no end. These messianic prophecies poured from Isaiah's lips with a specificity and beauty that set them apart from anything else in prophetic literature. He saw a future king who would judge not by appearances but with righteousness, who would decide with equity for the poor of the earth. He envisioned a transformed creation where wolves would live with lambs and leopards would lie down with goats, where a little child would lead predators and prey in peaceful coexistence. He described a holy mountain where the knowledge of the Lord would cover the earth as waters cover the sea. The most remarkable of these visions concerned a figure Isaiah called the servant of the Lord, a mysterious person whose identity scholars would debate for millennia, but whose portrait would find its ultimate interpretation in events that occurred 700 years after Isaiah's death. This servant would be chosen by God, filled with the Spirit, given the mission of bringing justice to the nations. He would not shout or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he would not break, a smouldering wick he would not snuff out. He would faithfully bring forth justice, but the servant would also suffer. Isaiah saw this with terrible clarity, describing wounds and rejection, oppression and condemnation, a death among the wicked and a burial among the rich. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. The servant would be pierced for transgressions not his own, crushed for iniquities he did not commit. His punishment would bring peace to others, his wounds would bring healing. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. The suffering servant passages became the interpretive key that later generations would use to understand events they could not otherwise comprehend. When a carpenter's son from Nazareth hung on a Roman cross, those who had ears to hear recognized the fulfillment of what Isaiah had seen in visions centuries before. The prophet who had volunteered for a ministry of apparent failure had spoken words that would make sense of the most significant death in human history. His apparently futile preaching had planted seeds that would bear fruit beyond anything he could have imagined. The reign of Hezekiah brought a brief respite from the spiritual decline that had characterized Ahaz's tenure. Here was a king who actually listened, who implemented reforms, who tore down the high places and broke the bronze serpent that had become an object of idolatrous worship. Isaiah served as counselor to this faithful monarch, and for a season, it seemed possible that Judah might yet turn from the path of destruction. The great test came when Sennacherib of Assyria invaded with an army that had never been defeated. City after city fell before the Assyrian advance. The fortress of Lachish was taken, its population killed or deported, its walls breached by siege ramps that archaeologists would later excavate and marvel at. Jerusalem stood alone, surrounded by an enemy that had no apparent weakness, commanded by a king who mocked the very idea that any god could resist Assyrian power. Hezekiah brought the threatening letter to the temple, the same temple where Isaiah had seen the Lord, and spread it before the altar. The king's prayer was a model of faith under pressure. Now, Lord our God, deliver us from his hand, so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone, Lord, are God. Isaiah sent word to the king that his prayer had been heard. The Assyrian army would not enter the city, would not shoot an arrow against it, would not even build a siege ramp. God himself would defend Jerusalem for his own sake and for the sake of David, his servant. That night death swept through the Assyrian camp. 185,000 soldiers died before morning, struck down by the angel of the Lord. Sennacherib retreated to Nineveh, where he would later be assassinated by his own sons in the temple of his own god. The deliverance was so complete, so manifestly divine, that it became a defining memory for Jerusalem, proof that God could and would protect his city when his people trusted him. Isaiah lived long enough to see this vindication, this demonstration that the promises he had spoken were not empty words. But he also saw Hezekiah make the mistake of showing Babylon's envoys all his treasures, displaying the wealth that would one day draw Babylonian armies to plunder what Assyria had failed to take. The prophet's final recorded words to Hezekiah were a prediction of that future disaster. The time will surely come when everything in your palace and all that your predecessors have stored up until this day will be carried off to Babylon. The reprieve under Hezekiah was genuine but temporary. The trajectory toward exile had been bent but not broken. Tradition holds that Isaiah died during the reign of Manasseh, Hezekiah's son, who reversed every reform his father had implemented and filled Jerusalem with the blood of innocents. According to ancient Jewish sources, the prophet was martyred, sawn in two, hidden in a hollow tree, killed for speaking truth that the corrupt king could not tolerate. If this tradition is accurate, then Isaiah's end was consistent with his calling. He had accepted a mission that promised difficulty rather than triumph, faithfulness rather than visible success. He had spoken to closed ears for 6 decades and died still speaking, the words that his generation rejected becoming the inheritance of every generation that followed. The book that bears his name became the longest and most influential of all prophetic writings. Its 66 chapters contain some of the most quoted passages in religious literature: comfort for mourners, hope for the hopeless, promises of restoration that have sustained Jewish and Christian communities through millennia of suffering. Comfort, comfort, my people, the book cries in its 40th chapter, marking a turn from judgment to hope, from condemnation to consolation. Those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. The throne room vision that began Isaiah's ministry cast its light across everything that followed. The holiness he had witnessed became the lens through which he viewed all human affairs. The seraphim's cry of "Holy, holy, holy" echoed through his oracles, establishing a standard against which nations and individuals would be measured. The purification he had experienced became the template for understanding how sinful people could stand in the presence of a holy God. The commission he had accepted became the pattern for all subsequent prophetic calling, God asking, humans responding, the mission proceeding regardless of visible results. And the words he had spoken in that moment of surrender, "Here am I, send me," became an invitation that extended far beyond Isaiah's own life and circumstances. Every generation since has heard that question echoing from the throne: whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Every person who has sensed divine calling has faced the same choice Isaiah faced: to volunteer or to refuse, to step forward into uncertainty or to hang back in the safety of the uncommitted. The response Isaiah modelled remains the only appropriate response when heaven speaks. Not, "Here am I, but let me first understand the full plan." Not, "Here am I, but only if success is guaranteed." Not, "Here am I, but what about my comfort, my security, my reputation?" Simply, "Here am I, send me." Availability offered without conditions, willingness extended without negotiation, trust placed in the one who calls rather than in the one who is called. The young man who climbed the temple steps in the year that King Uzziah died had no idea what waited for him in those courts. He carried only his questions, his fears, his vague sense that something was wrong with the world, and his desperate hope that someone might be able to fix it. He found more than he sought, a vision of holiness that shattered his self-understanding, a purification that burned away his guilt, a calling that would define the rest of his existence. He said yes to a mission he did not fully understand, and in saying yes, he became a voice that still speaks across the centuries, still comforts the afflicted, still calls the comfortable to account, still points toward a future when the knowledge of the Lord will cover the earth as waters cover the sea. The temple where Isaiah saw the Lord no longer stands. The throne room he entered remains invisible to mortal eyes. The seraphim continue their eternal antiphon where no human ear can hear. But the story endures because the God who spoke to Isaiah continues to speak, continues to ask his question, continues to wait for those who will answer. Whom shall I send? Who will go for us? The question hangs in the air of every sanctuary where worshippers gather, every quiet moment when a soul becomes aware of something larger than itself, every crisis that demands a response beyond human adequacy. It is not a question for the qualified or the confident. It is a question for the broken who have been healed, the unclean who have been purified, the fearful who have discovered that obedience matters more than outcomes. Here am I, send me. The words echo still, waiting to be spoken again by anyone willing to speak them. the vision of holiness remains available to anyone willing to see it. The fire that purifies still burns on the altar of divine grace, ready to touch unclean lips and transform them into instruments of proclamation. Isaiah's story ended with his death, but the calling he answered continues. The God who was high and exalted in that ancient throne room remains high and exalted still. His robe still fills the temple of creation. His holiness still exposes human pretension. His grace still offers cleansing to all who confess their need. And his question still awaits an answer. Whom shall I send? The invitation stands open. The mission continues. And somewhere in every generation, voices still rise with the response that changes everything. Here am I. Send me.